What if everything you knew about yourself was a lie? What if your past had been stolen, your identity erased, and the people you trusted most were the ones who betrayed you? Alexander Grayson had spent his entire life forging his own destiny. From a penniless orphan struggling through the foster system to a self-made billionaire, his rise was nothing short of legendary. At 32, he stood at the helm of Grayson Technologies, one of the most powerful cybersecurity firms in the world. He was respected, feared, and admired in equal measure, a man who had built his empire with sheer willpower and ruthless intelligence. But everything changed on a night that should have been just another victory. It started with a cyber attack, an unprecedented breach into Grayson Technologies' heavily fortified servers. The company's security infrastructure, which Alexander himself had designed, was considered impenetrable. And yet, someone had not only managed to infiltrate, but had targeted specific files. The nature of the attack was unusual. It wasn't an attempt to steal corporate secrets, sabotage operations, or extort money. Instead, the hackers had accessed a single, seemingly irrelevant document, his personal file. At first, Alexander dismissed it as a coincidence. Maybe a disgruntled former employee was attempting to leak personal information. Maybe it was a competitor seeking dirt on him. He had made plenty of enemies on his way to the top, but when his chief security officer, a former NSA specialist, called him in the middle of the night, his blood ran cold. "Sir, we found something strange. The document they accessed, your birth records, they don't match any official database. Actually, they don't exist at all." Alexander frowned. "That's impossible. I've used that file for background checks, passports, everything. There's no way it's fake." The officer hesitated. "It's not just fake, it's fabricated. The social security number, the birth certificate, everything was created out of thin air about 30 years ago. There's no history of an Alexander Grayson before the age of 4. A heavy silence filled the room. "Run a deep trace," Alexander ordered, his voice dangerously calm. "Find out who the hell did this." For the next several days, his team dug relentlessly. Every piece of his past, school records, medical history, even childhood photographs, came under scrutiny. The deeper they went, the more anomalies they found. His earliest childhood records were sparse, fragmented. There were no baby pictures, no hospital birth records, no documentation of his parents beyond a forged adoption paper. His supposed birth town in Ohio had no records of a Grayson family. His social security number belonged to someone who had died as an infant. The evidence was undeniable. His entire identity was a lie. Alexander felt the world shift beneath him. He had spent his whole life believing in one truth, that he was a self-made man, that he had clawed his way out of nothingness. But now it seemed that even his past had been stolen from someone else. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A junior analyst, while scanning old missing persons cases, stumbled upon something disturbing. A child had disappeared nearly 3 decades ago. Sebastian Lockwood, heir to the Lockwood Dynasty, one of the wealthiest families in the country. The case had been heavily publicized at the time. The Lockwoods had searched endlessly for their missing son, offering millions in rewards, hiring private investigators, and even involving the FBI. But the child had vanished without a trace. As Alexander stared at the digital rendering of what Sebastian Lockwood would look like as an adult, a sickening realization hit him. He wasn't just looking at a stranger, he was looking at himself. Alexander Grayson, no, Sebastian Lockwood, sat in his penthouse office, staring blankly at the city skyline. The revelation from days ago still haunted him. Everything he thought he knew about himself had been a carefully constructed lie. He wasn't an orphan who had clawed his way out of nothingness. He had been stolen from a life of privilege, from a family that had never stopped searching for him. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. His mind raced with questions, each more unsettling than the last. Why was I taken? Who was behind it? Why was my identity erased so completely? The more he thought about it, the more one possibility stood out. The Lockwoods were one of the richest and most powerful families in the country. Someone had a reason to make their only heir disappear. But before confronting the family, Alexander needed answers. He ordered his security team to dig into Vincent Lockwood, his uncle, and the current CEO of Lockwood Industries. A ruthless businessman, Vincent had taken over shortly after Charles Lockwood, Alexander's biological father, died under mysterious circumstances. The timeline was too perfect to ignore. Charles had been alive for a year after Alexander was kidnapped. But had he known the truth? Had he tried to find his son, only to be silenced? The next step was clear: infiltrate the Lockwood estate. Under the guise of a business investor, Alexander arranged a meeting with Vincent Lockwood to discuss a potential partnership. The Lockwoods had long been involved in finance, pharmaceuticals, and real estate, and their global influence was unparalleled. The request was granted immediately. After all, who would turn down a meeting with Alexander Grayson, the billionaire tech mogul? On the day of the meeting, Alexander arrived at Lockwood Manor, a sprawling estate that seemed more like a kingdom than a home. The moment he stepped through the gates, an eerie sense of déjà vu washed over him. He had never been here before, at least not that he remembered, but something about the grand halls, the marble staircases, and the scent of aged oak felt familiar. His heart pounded when he saw her. Evelyn Lockwood, his mother. She was older now, her once golden hair streaked with silver, her regal beauty untouched by time. But what struck Alexander the most was her eyes, deep, sorrowful, and carrying an unbearable weight of loss. When she saw him, she froze. It was only for a fraction of a second, but in that brief moment, her expression changed. A flicker of recognition, of something buried deep inside. She quickly masked it, forcing a polite smile, but Alexander knew what he saw. For the rest of the meeting, he observed Vincent Lockwood. The man was everything he had expected, calculating, composed, and entirely devoid of warmth. He spoke in measured tones, his words dripping with the confidence of a man who had spent his life controlling everything around him. But what Alexander was really watching for was his reaction to him. Vincent showed no sign of recognition, no flicker of hesitation, no unease. Either he truly didn't suspect a thing, or he was a master manipulator. But then came something unexpected. A butler, an elderly man who had served the Lockwoods for decades, entered the room to pour drinks. As he set a glass in front of Alexander, his hands trembled violently, his eyes widened, and his breath hitched. He stared at Alexander as if he had just seen a ghost. That was all the confirmation Alexander needed. Someone in this house knew the truth. Confrontation and confession. Later that night, Alexander stayed behind under the pretense of discussing business details. When the house was quieter, he found the butler alone in the servants' quarters. The man was pale, sweating, as if holding back decades of secrets. "You knew, didn't you?" Alexander said coldly. The butler stiffened. "Sir, I don't know what you mean." Alexander slammed a folder onto the table. Inside were old case files, newspaper clippings, and a childhood photo of Sebastian Lockwood. "Look at me and tell me I'm not him." The butler's lip quivered. I can't." Tension crackled in the air. "Tell me what you know," Alexander pressed. Tears welled in the old man's eyes as he whispered, "You were taken because you were an obstacle. Your father, Charles, he wanted to change things. He planned to hand control of Lockwood Industries to you when you came of age, stripping power away from Vincent. But Vincent, he couldn't let that happen." The words sent a shiver down Alexander's spine. "Vincent had a deal made," the butler continued, voice barely above a whisper. "You weren't supposed to be killed, just removed, given to a couple who would raise you away from all this." The pieces clicked into place. The Graysons, the people he had called parents, weren't random. They had been chosen, paid. Alexander clenched his fists. His entire life had been a lie, orchestrated by greed and ambition. As he left the manor that night, his course was clear. He wasn't just reclaiming his identity. He was taking back everything that was stolen from him. Alexander Grayson, Sebastian Lockwood, had spent his life mastering control. In the cutthroat world of business, emotions were a liability, and weakness was an invitation for destruction. But now, standing on the precipice of a truth that threatened to unravel everything, he felt something foreign, something he hadn't experienced in years. Rage, not just anger, but a deep seething fury that coursed through his veins like liquid fire. For 30 years, he had lived a stolen life. For 30 years, his mother had searched for him, unaware that the people responsible for her pain were inside her own home. And now, He had proof that his uncle Vincent Lockwood had orchestrated his disappearance because power was worth more than blood. But one question still remained. Was Vincent the mastermind, or was there someone even more powerful behind the conspiracy? Alexander knew that if he wanted answers, he had to play the long game. Bursting through the gates with accusations wouldn't work. Vincent was too well connected, too powerful. Instead, Alexander had to become a predator, circling his prey, exposing the truth piece by piece until Vincent had nowhere left to hide. And so, the hunt began. Using his resources at Grayson Technologies, Alexander ordered his most trusted cybersecurity team to comb through old Lockwood records, looking for discrepancies, hidden accounts, or anything that could tie Vincent to the kidnapping. It didn't take long to find something strange. Shortly after Charles Lockwood's death, a large sum of money had been transferred to an offshore account under a name that no longer existed. But the real breakthrough came when Alexander tracked down an old investigator, one of the first men hired to search for young Sebastian Lockwood after his disappearance. The man, Frank Delacroix, had been a former FBI agent turned private investigator, but after a year on the case, he had suddenly dropped it entirely, moved states, and vanished from the public eye. That alone was suspicious. Alexander flew to Miami to confront him. Frank was reluctant at first, refusing to talk, but Alexander wasn't in the mood for patience. After a little persuasion, and by persuasion that meant hacking into Frank's finances and exposing the fact that he had received a $2 million payout the year after the investigation was dropped, the truth finally came spilling out. "I was getting close," Frank admitted, voice tight with regret. "Too close. I had traced some witness statements that didn't match up, found inconsistencies in the timeline of your disappearance. And then, one night, I got a call." "From who?" Alexander demanded. Frank swallowed hard. "Vincent Lockwood. He told me to drop the case. When I refused, I was bribed. When I refused again, I was threatened. Told that if I didn't back off, my family would disappear, just like you did. I had a wife and kids, man. I had no choice." Alexander's fists clenched. The picture was becoming clearer. Vincent had ordered the cover-up. But that wasn't the end of it. "There's something else," Frank said, lowering his voice. "Your father, Charles Lockwood, he knew?" Alexander's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean he knew?" Frank's expression darkened. "Before he died, Charles was starting to suspect something. He had hired his own investigator to re-examine your case. But before anything could come of it, well, you know what happened. Charles Lockwood's death had been ruled an accident, a heart attack, completely natural. But now, with everything Alexander had uncovered, the truth was undeniable. It hadn't been an accident. His father had been murdered. And the moment that realization sank in, the fury inside Alexander ignited into something else entirely: vengeance. The next step was clear. Vincent Lockwood had spent years covering his tracks, but now, for the first time, someone was chasing him, and Alexander wanted him to know it. That night, Vincent arrived at his private estate, an isolated mansion overlooking the cliffs of New England. He dismissed his guards at the gate, heading inside, unaware that someone else was already waiting for him. Alexander sat in the darkened study, fingers steepled together as he watched his uncle enter. The moment Vincent saw him, he froze. "Alexander," he said smoothly, masking his surprise. "Or should I say, Sebastian?" There it was. No denial, no feigned confusion, just the cold acknowledgement of the truth. "You knew," Alexander said. His voice was calm, controlled, deadly. "You knew who I was the moment we met, didn't you?" Vincent smirked. "You have your mother's eyes. It was quite obvious." Alexander leaned forward. "You took everything from me." Vincent sighed, as if he were being inconvenienced. "Sebastian, listen to me. Don't call me that." A flicker of irritation crossed Vincent's face before he regained his composure. "Very well, Alexander. I understand this must be overwhelming, but you've built something incredible. A name, a legacy. You don't need the Lockwoods. Let the past stay buried." Alexander smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't get to decide that." Vincent's expression turned to steel. "And what exactly do you plan to do? Expose me? Bring me down? You think you can touch me?" He let out a low chuckle. I own senators, judges, the media. You're just an outsider, playing in a world you don't understand. Alexander stood. Then I guess it's time for a change in leadership. Vincent's smile faltered for the first time. Consider this a warning, Alexander continued. You spent 30 years erasing me. Now, I'm going to erase you. And with that, he walked out, leaving his uncle standing in the dark, finally afraid for the first time in his life. The battle lines had been drawn. Vincent Lockwood now knew that Alexander, Sebastian Lockwood, was coming for him. But what he didn't know was just how far Alexander was willing to go. After their confrontation, Alexander intensified his attack. He systematically stripped away Vincent's power, leveraging his own corporate influence, technology, and connections to expose the hidden cracks in Lockwood Industries. Whistleblowers suddenly came forward. Investigative journalists began digging into past financial irregularities, tracing years of fraudulent dealings. Regulators started looking into offshore accounts, bribery trails, and contracts that Vincent had buried deep. Bit by bit, the empire he had stolen was beginning to crumble. But Alexander knew Vincent wouldn't go down without a fight. As Alexander closed in on Vincent, he also had unfinished business with the Graysons, the people who had raised him under a false identity. David and Margaret Grayson were desperate. They had spent decades profiting off the wealth Vincent had given them in exchange for raising the kidnapped heir. Now, that protection was gone. They attempted to flee the country, but Alexander was already ahead of them. When they arrived at a private airstrip, ready to board a chartered jet, they found him waiting. Margaret gasped, clutching her husband's arm. Please, Alexander, we did what we had to do. David, always the more pragmatic of the two, tried to maintain composure. We raised you. We gave you a life. You wouldn't be the man you are today without us. Alexander's expression was unreadable. You stole my life. And for what? A payout? Margaret broke down. We didn't have a choice. If we refused, they would have killed us. Alexander stepped closer. And if you had told me the truth? Neither of them had an answer. He took out a folder, a signed confession, detailing their role in his kidnapping. You're going to take responsibility for what you did, he said, or I'll make sure you end up like Vincent. David paled. He knew what that meant. Margaret hesitated, then shakily reached for a pen. With tears streaming down her face, she signed. It was over for them. Alexander turned his back as they were escorted away, their past finally catching up to them. With the Graysons neutralized, Alexander focused on delivering the final strike against Vincent. Evelyn Lockwood, his biological mother, had finally been shown the full truth. The pain of betrayal was etched on her face, but when she stood beside her son, there was strength in her eyes. It's time, she said. In a press conference, the Lockwood family made a public announcement. Vincent's financial crimes, his conspiracy to kidnap the rightful heir, his involvement in Charles Lockwood's death. The evidence was undeniable. The FBI raided Vincent's private office that same evening. As he was being led away in handcuffs, he turned to Alexander with a cold smile. You think this is over? He murmured. You don't understand this world yet. You've just made yourself a target. Alexander met his gaze without fear. And you just made yourself history. The empire Vincent Lockwood had spent decades building collapsed overnight. With his arrest, Lockwood Industries stocks plummeted, investors pulled out, and government investigations uncovered a labyrinth of fraud, bribery, and corporate corruption. The company that once stood as a symbol of power and wealth was now a sinking ship. But for Alexander, Sebastian Lockwood, the war was far from over. Vincent's final words haunted him. You think this is over? You've just made yourself a target. And he was right. Days after Vincent's arrest, an assassin broke into Alexander's penthouse. If it weren't for his state-of-the-art security system, he would have never heard the intruder coming. But the moment the red dot of a sniper scope flickered against the glass, he moved. The bullet shattered his window, embedding itself into his leather chair. Reacting on instinct, Alexander pulled a concealed firearm from his desk and took cover. The assassin was fast, highly trained. A professional. A second shot rang out, but Alexander anticipated it, diving behind a marble pillar. With calculated precision, he aimed and fired, hitting the intruder square in the shoulder. The assassin stumbled, But instead of retreating, he did something chilling. He smiled. Then, before Alexander could stop him, he pulled a pill from his sleeve and swallowed it. Within seconds, his body collapsed lifelessly to the floor. Alexander clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. Someone else was pulling the strings. Determined to uncover the real mastermind, Alexander turned to his most trusted cybersecurity team. If Vincent was the one who had him kidnapped, who had just tried to kill him? The answer came faster than expected. All financial trails from the assassin's bank account led to Eleanor Westfield, the chairwoman of the Lockwood Board of Directors. Eleanor had been one of Vincent's strongest allies, a woman who had quietly consolidated power in the background, while others fought for control. She had known that, with Vincent gone, Alexander posed the greatest threat to her influence. She had ordered the hit. Alexander wasted no time. With the help of the FBI, he orchestrated an operation to take her down. Through leaked documents, hidden accounts, and wiretaps, he exposed how she had manipulated Lockwood Industries from the shadows, funding illegal deals, suppressing evidence, and orchestrating Vincent's rise to power. When the authorities moved in, Eleanor tried to flee the country. She almost made it, but as her private jet prepared for takeoff, federal agents stormed the tarmac, dragging her out in handcuffs. She screamed, cursed, threatened lawsuits, but it didn't matter. The dynasty she had fought to protect was finished. Now, the Lockwood Empire was his for the taking. The board of directors, those who had betrayed his father and allowed corruption to fester, were all gone. The throne was his. But as Alexander sat in the grand office of Lockwood Tower, staring at the legacy left behind, a thought gnawed at him. Did he really want this? For 30 years, the Lockwood name had been associated with deception, crime, and greed. If he stepped into this role, could he ever truly erase that legacy? And then there was his mother, Evelyn Lockwood. She had fought for decades to find him, had endured unimaginable pain believing her son was gone. But now that he was back, he wasn't the same person she had lost. He was Alexander Grayson. And that would never change. Alexander made his choice. He renounced the Lockwood name and walked away from the empire. Instead, he secured the company's assets, dissolving Lockwood Industries and transferring its wealth into philanthropic foundations, scholarships, and rebuilding communities. For the first time in history, a billionaire dynasty wasn't passed down. It was dismantled. Evelyn was heartbroken, but she understood. "I lost a son 30 years ago," she whispered, "and I found a man who's stronger than anyone I've ever known." Alexander looked at her, eyes softening. "You never lost me. I just had to find my own way back." Months later, Alexander stood at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the mansion where he was meant to grow up. It had been sold, the money given to charity. For the first time in his life, he was free. Not an heir, not a stolen child, just a man who had taken back his own destiny. And as he walked away, leaving the past behind, he knew one thing for certain. His name was Alexander Grayson, and that was the only legacy he needed.